I've owned the Sony a6000 for over 2 years now, and in today's video we're going to be discussing the good and the bad and if it's still the best inexpensive camera that you can buy on the market in 2023. Let's dive in. Some people are calling this the camera of the decade, and I don't know if I'd go that far, but stay tuned till the end of the video where I give a clear response to this question. Let's start first with photography and specifically what is good about this camera. So it is a 24.3 megapixel crop sensor, APS-C, and what's good about this is it gives us enough room to crop in our images and recompose them in post without losing too much quality. The second thing I love about this camera is that it has a viewfinder, and it seems standard, but I also own the Sony a5000 and it's lacking that. This camera is an interchangeable lens camera, so it does support all the E-mount cameras that have come out, and there are some really inexpensive good lenses out there. Also, this camera is really good in terms of photography for burst mode if we think about the age. So it has 11 frames per second shooting in RAW. It's really easy to transfer your images from your camera to your phone using Wi-Fi, so that technology has held up pretty good. The last few things that I'll say is that it has pretty good autofocus and it even has face detect, but the problem with that is that you have to set it up in your menu system. But when you hold down that button, it is going to detect faces, which is good. And it has a fully functional manual mode, which is perfect for beginners if you want to learn your ISO, your aperture, your shutter speed, your white balance. This is one of the best cameras to learn on for that. And then lastly, it has upgraded buttons and dials on the camera, which makes the overall experience a whole lot better for photography. If you're enjoying this video, please feel free to give it a like. It goes a really long way in helping my channel get noticed. Let's dive back in. Next, let's talk about video and what's good about this camera specifically. So it does shoot pretty high quality 1080p footage with continuous autofocus. For the first time ever in these a6000 or a5000 cameras, it shoots with the XAVC codec, which allows you to shoot at a higher bit rate, specifically 50 megabits per second. You can also shoot up to 60 frames per second on this camera in 50 megabits per second, so that's pretty good. You can shoot a neutral or flat profile, and you can change some of the settings like sharpness and contrast to get a little bit more like cine style look, and then you can apply your own colors in post. It has zebras and focus peaking, so that really helps too. And then it has a dedicated record button on the side, which is actually a lot smaller than the a5000, but at least it's still there. One cautionary piece of this camera is that when you're shooting vertical videos for Instagram or TikTok or YouTube Shorts, make sure, because it only shoots at 1080p, it's gonna be really hard to punch in on that footage and crop and recompose. So make sure your composition is really good if you're shooting vertical video with this camera. So let's talk a little bit about what's good about this camera for features. So number one, it does have a tilt screen, which is pretty solid, and a lot of photographers do like this. So it's not just the tilt up, but it also comes out a little bit. The size of this camera, it's small and compact, and for me, it's my second camera that I throw in my bag. It has a hot shoe for external flashes, or even for, I have an external Sony proprietary microphone that I could run off this camera. It has clear image zoom, which allows you to digitally zoom in or crop in on your image, and that extends the length of your lens. This camera takes USB micro B, which everyone has a lot of cables lying around the house. I'm sure you can find it in an old drawer, and if not, you can find them for like $1 or $2 at the thrift store. The ergonomics of this camera feels so much better in the hand than the Sony a5000. It has a nice big grip on it, so it does feel more comfortable. We already talked about the buttons and dials, that layout that is changed. So I really do like that about the camera. And lastly, it still supports that built-in flash. Next up, let's talk about the cons of this camera, specifically for photography. And there aren't a lot, to be honest, which is really in favor of this camera. But what I have written down here is that it can be noisy over 800 ISO. So what you're gonna need, and there's a lot on the market, even inexpensive ones, is you're gonna need a lens with a lower aperture to compensate for this. This camera doesn't have a silent shutter option, and that could be a detriment to you, specifically if you're shooting weddings. The autofocus on this camera could be a little bit better, and it was upgraded soon after in the a6100. So if you see two on the used market, you might want to go for the a6100 if that autofocus is really important to you. It is a crop sensor, and that means it's going to be a little bit harder to get true wide lenses, though a lot did come out last year from Sony and third-party manufacturers in 2022. So what sucks about this camera in terms of video? So number one, it doesn't shoot 4K, but what can we expect with a camera this old? Second thing is that it doesn't have a microphone input, so no microphone, no headphone input. So that actually sucks. You can't monitor audio, and you can't even just plug in like a normal 3.5mm microphone. And lastly, this camera doesn't support in-body image stabilization, but that's kind of fine because Sony came out with a lot of optical steady shot lenses that will stabilize your footage for you. What are the cons of this camera when it comes to the feature set? So number one, it has no flippy screen. So even the Sony a6000 had the one that would flip up and you could take selfies and things like that with it. As most of you know, the battery life on these cameras aren't great. So you're gonna need like at least 3 of these batteries if you're putting it to any real world use. E-mount lenses are great, and that's actually a pro of this camera that you can just pop on any E-mount lens. But if you want a good E-mount lens, this could easily cost you double or triple the amount of the camera body in 2023. Last two is that it doesn't have a leveling gauge built in, and it doesn't support touchscreen at all, but now we're just getting picky with this camera. So is the Sony a6000 still the best inexpensive camera out there in 2023? Well, with the exception of maybe the Sony a5000, if you're even more of a beginner, I say it's a resounding yes. It's gotta be one of the best cameras that you can pick up used on the market with photo and video features. It's not amazing for video, don't pick it up just for that. But if you're looking to do some hybrid shooting and you're just getting into this craft, I highly recommend it. All it takes to make this camera look good is pairing it with a really nice lens. So a lot of people talk about the Tamron 17-70. If you want to cover like a big focal range and just have that one convenient lens on the camera, but people also talk about the Sigma primes, and I've owned those too, and they are really sharp, good quality. If you'd like to check out an even cheaper Sony camera body option, I'll link a video here I did last week of the Sony a5000, and in next week's video, I'll compare the two, the Sony a5000 versus 6000. Is it worth the extra money in 2023, even on the used market? Make sure you like this video or give it a sub if I provided any value. Thank you so much for stopping by. If you made it this far, you're a real one, and we will see you in the next one. Matty out. Peace.